also one of the organisers of this seminar series, along with Ashton. And so, yeah, today it's my pleasure to welcome Sandeep Pillai from Bocconi University, who will be presenting a paper on the benefits offered by historical explanation statistical studies in strategic management. Before that, though, there are a few housekeeping points. So Sandeep will present his paper for about 30 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for questions and answers. Please feel free to post questions and comments in the chat during the talk, as we will be addressing these as part of the Q&A session that follows. Please keep your microphones muted during the presentation, just to allow for clarity in terms of the speaker. And then in terms of the discussion, we'll probably invite you to say your questions, even if you put it in the chat, because often it's easier than just repeating what's in the chat. But feel free to do as you wish. Please also note the presentation will be recorded and subsequently distributed on YouTube and other social media. Should you wish your contribution to be edited out, please inform us, the Business History Collective, that you'd like that done, and that can be done at bizhiscollective@gmail.com. So with that out of the way, let me introduce our speaker. Sandeep serves as an assistant professor at the Management and Technology Department at Bocconi University in Italy. He uses a combination of historical methods and statistical analysis to explore the uncertainties that firms encounter in early stage industries, the capabilities needed to overcome these uncertainties, and who can overcome them. The paper that Sandeep presents is co-authored with his PhD advisors, Brent Goldfarb and David Kirsch, who serve as associate professors at the University of Maryland Smith School of Business, and they also join us here today. So without further ado then, I'm pleased to welcome you to the floor, Sandeep. If you'd like to unmute and share your slides, you can start when ready.
Thank you, Adam. Let me just go
sharing this.
I hope you can see my slides now. Yeah, okay. Perfect. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to Adam and the other organizers for organizing the seminar series. We are very excited to present this paper, and we look forward to hearing your comments. Because now it's moving. Because I've not had the pleasure of meeting many of you in person, just to shortly introduce myself. As Adam mentioned, I'm at Bocconi University. I'm interested in studying entrepreneurs in early stage industries. My first, and I guess I started engaging with historical methods when I was working on my dissertation, which was on the early American automobile industry. And subsequently, I've had a couple of papers published in SMJ, Strategic Management Journal. And in general, I'm interested in using historical methods to publish in strategy journals like Strategic Management Journal, Management Science, etc. And this history is actually quite current in those journals in one sense, because in the last few years we've had there's been a lot of special issues in these journals that is focusing on history. Now, even though there is an appreciation among people and everyone says history really matters, often there isn't an understanding of why does it matter, how does it matter, when does it matter, etc. In fact, I faced this challenge when I was in the job market, where I was asked questions like, why not just go and study the Silicon Valley? Why don't you just go and do an experiment? Right? And quite frankly, that I did not have a good answer to that question that was really grounded in the philosophy of science or anything. And so, I decided to channel my anger into writing this paper. So this is a bit of a anger management therapy piece for me, this paper. So when we think of strategy and history, so when we think of strategy, strategy we use different types of theoretical lens in strategy. We study at different levels. We use different methodologies. But the one fact thread that brings all of this together is this question about why are some more successful than others? And I don't need to tell this room that history is fundamentally interested in helping us understand the past. The reality is, unless you are doing a randomized controlled trial experiment, most of the strategy studies are set in the past, right? So you're looking at events that happened in the past, companies from the past, etc. But the problem is strategy scholars do not really often treat past as just as a setting and don't really engage with it. So in a typical strategy paper, you will see maybe a small background. You may see some sort of chronology that does not really tell you why certain events were selected or how that is related to the overall theory. And you all see a lot of reductionist dummy variable that really tries to condense all the aspects of the context into it. And another interesting distinction between strategy and history is, strategy is actually more interested in prediction, right? So we are unlike we are, at the end of the day, we have to advise managers who pay big bucks for our MBA courses, and so we are really interested in prediction. And at the core of this is this tension, where on one hand we want to predict the future, and on the other hand, we want to come up with findings that are as true as possible for the context. And this tension that has been in there in strategy really becomes quite important as we move forward. So let me start off with an example to just set the stage. So one of the most widely cited example of the benefits of vertical integration is the General Motors acquisition of Fisher Body in 1926. The argument made by Klein et al. In this, where that example originally comes from, is that there were General Motors was dealing with a lot of holdup costs, where essentially Fisher Body had a cost plus contract, as a result of which they were not adopting innovative manufacturing techniques. They were locating their plants far away from the assembly line, etc. And they didn't have any incentive, and they were behaving in an opportunistic manner. And so vertical integration helped General Motors reduce these costs. Now, this example, I mean, if we think about the virtues of an explanation, right? And I'll get into that a little bit later. This is a very fruitful explanation in the sense that this has really formed the foundation for a lot of other studies, as evidenced by the 9,000 plus citations that it has, right? It is a very parsimonious explanation. It is quite simple in the sense that it is a very much a cost. There aren't a lot of variables. It's really mostly about cost. There aren't many scope conditions identified. It is a very universal explanation. Any situation where there is make or buy, we can apply this explanation. And from a likelihood perspective, like a general likelihood perspective, this really, we can believe that, look, we know that people behave opportunistically. So it's not really hard for us to believe that Fisher Body behaved opportunistically, and GM wanted to deal with that. And it's a very coherent explanation in the sense that it really plays well with the transaction cost economics idea. Now, years go by, and with digitization, we have access to more records. And when scholars started looking at this case again, it really updated our understanding. So it wasn't clear that actually there were a lot of holdup costs. It wasn't. There was no evidence of inefficient processes being used by Fisher Body, mostly because when GM purchased Fisher Body, they actually only purchased about 40%. They already owned 60% of Fisher Body from 1990. Right, so there weren't many holdup costs, and far from holdup being a problem, it was, there is some evidence that it was very much a trust-based relationship. And a concern General Motors had was that, the Fisher brothers were actually thinking of retiring, and they did not want to lose that control and that trust-based relationship. Now, of course, vertical integration, reducing hold-up costs is a lot more, from a philosophy of science perspective, is a lot more fruitful, or a lot more, for us in plain language, a lot more interesting than saying that, look, they bought the factory because there was somebody was retiring. And on a side note, none of these people in this discussion actually are historians. They are all economists or sociologists. So one reason for the historians to really care about our paper is that you guys just missed out on 10,000 citations. Okay, so what is happening here is fundamentally is that you have Klein and you have the others coming up with different conjectures about observed evidence. They're really coming up with different explanations, right? The Klein explanation, may give more prominence to virtues of such as parsimony and universality, versus the other explanation is giving more focus to virtues such as consilience with facts on the ground. So this is what most of history and strategy engages in this process of coming up with conjectures for observed evidence. They come up with explanation. And from a philosophy of science perspective, what is happening is in history and strategy, you are inferring to the best explanation, right? So for our argument, we are going to say that IBE is the same, or inference to the best explanation is the same as abduction. There is some debate in philosophy of science about the similarities and differences. I'm not going to get into that, but it's the same. And the process is that you generate a list of candidate explanations, and then you select the best explanation from those candidate explanations. So this is what's happening. The challenge is, how do you generate and select explanations, right? I mean, most of the statistical studies rely on, strategy studies rely on statistics, and statistics is not designed or good at generating explanations. So what scholars have to do is they have to rely on existing theories. In 1978, when Klein came up with the explanation, TCE was all the rage. In the last 20 years, we've had a lot of studies that look at human capital. And if we were to do the same studies today, one of the explanations that we consider is definitely would be human capital that GM purchased. In fact, there's some evidence that GM may have purchased for human capital. But the problem is, if we only rely on the repertoire of explanations, the repertoire of theories that are available to us, we may be coming up with an explanation that is divorced from what is actually happening in the context. Now, in terms of selection, statistics is actually unable to eliminate alternate explanations. And in fact, there are papers who have, I'm not going to get into why that is the case. There are studies that have done that, but it is unable to eliminate the alternatives. And if you look at history, the relationship, based on our reading at least, the relationship between the methods used by historians and the philosophy and IBE, that is the link between history and the philosophy of science, is very unclear. So part of the contribution that we are trying to make is clarify this link between IBE, history, and strategy. And the argument we are making is that strategy, historical explanation improves the reliability of strategy research claims. That's the core argument that we are making in this paper. And it is able, and history is, sorry, it's not, okay. History is actually able to complement studies in strategy, because fundamentally the virtues that are being weighed are the explanatory virtues are weighed differently in history and in strategy. So I already spoke about the virtues a little bit, but just to refresh your memory, consilience means the ability to account for more facts. Coherence means how much your explanation fits with existing knowledge. Parsimony means simplicity. Basically, the fewer variables you have, the fewer scope conditions you have, the more parsimonious your explanation is. Universality is about generalizability. Fruitfulness is about how much further theories can you build out of this. I mean, you can think of it as a measure of fruitfulness is probably citations. And in terms of likelihood, typically there are two types of likelihood. One is the contextual likelihood, which is usually limited by our contextual knowledge, and general likelihood, which is basically generally, does this make sense, this explanation that we are coming up with. And what history allows us to do in strategy is that it allows us to balance the virtues that we have focused on in strategy with the virtues such as consilience and coherence that historical methods really focuses on. That's why history is very valuable to strategy. It is to balance these virtues. Now remember, these virtues are not quantifiable. Right? So inherently, there is judgment involved, right? So what historical methods help us do is really to make these judgment and to weigh these non-quantifiable virtues. So, I mean, what about history allows us to do that? So historians engage with the context a lot more seriously than strategy scholars do, right? So historians construct a historical explanation. As part of it, you construct narratives. We know that no evidence really speaks for itself. It's the narrative that gives meaning to the evidence, and there is infinite amount of facts that are probably available. From that, you have to select a subset, you have to emphasize certain facts, and you have to come up with a plot that sequences actors and events when you're building this narrative. What all of this does is it compels the researcher to consider more explanation such that the explanation accounts for more contextual details. This increases the consilience of an explanation, the process of contextualization. However, there is no free lunch. There are costs associated with it, right? So, the more details that the more contextual details that you accommodate, you probably highlight more scope conditions, and you probably identify more variables that you need to explain, which reduces parsimony, right? It reduces the simplicity, and it also reduces consequently the universality of the explanation, right? So, but what contextualization does is it reveals the cost of these virtues, right? Remember, I said judgment is involved. It gives us the ability to make judgments about which virtues to balance more or less. That's what history allows strategy scholars to do. The other prominent feature of an historical explanation is the fact that it accounts for actor perspectives, right? So, I mean, the problem often that we encounter is that when scholars engage in a retrospective sense making, it is really, very much, shall we say, colored by the theories that really cohere with their interests, right? That's they focus on their interests. So what history allows us to do is account for actors' preferences, their perceptions, their evaluation of alternatives, what information do they have, what were the expectations that they had, what are the options that they had, what are the constraints that they had, etc. Right? So again, I want to stress this idea of judgment, right? When you're imagining the perspective of any actor without direct observation, you are really engaging in some form of judgment. But because your explanation is in some ways rooted in judgments about actors' reality, you are increasing likelihood. But at the same time, you lost your ability to apply the theory that is of interest or that is of convenience to you into the context, which really constrains coherence, right? So again, it is this idea of balancing and how judgments, you can make judgments about balancing different virtues. The third aspect of historical explanation that is quite valuable is this idea of visibility. So, what historical records often do is it gives us the capacity to shift between different levels of analysis, such as individual, firm, group, industry, institutions, because of the retrospective viewpoint and the wider view that it offers, right? As a result, you're actually able to trace the intermediate steps of the mechanisms. And not only that, historical explanation identifies facts that your explanation must reconcile with. There may be, different sources, information from different sources that your explanation must reconcile with, discontinuities, it will identify outliers, etc. All of this, reconciling with all of this, will actually increase the consilience of your explanation and the contextual likelihood of your explanation. But the problem is, the more details that you try to incorporate into your explanation, you have to pay a price in terms of parsimony. So so again, judgment and balance between the virtues, that's what history offers. Now, I talked about accounting for facts, accounting for information. I mean, how do we know what the facts are? And this is where source criticism becomes extremely important. Source criticism essentially tells us, what is it that we are learning? Are we learning insights about the thinking of the author who created the document, or are we learning about the events? Because the purpose of the perspective of the author and the purpose of the records is very important. And also we need to ask questions like, why did this record survive, right? All of this basically identify facts for us that we should actually account for, which subsequently increases the consilience of the explanation. So let me start off by let me actually just give you just two quick examples. One is my current struggle, which is my job market paper. It is in the process of being prepared for resubmission. And the argument I make is, in the early American automobile industry, scaling was inability to scale was the reason why a lot of firms failed, and the scaling depended on management of interdependencies between product, production, and market, and that metalworking knowledge. People who had metalworking experience were the ones who were able to do this. The struggle in this, or the interesting part, I guess, whatever your perspective is, we have theories on spin-off that that has already looked at this industry, and in some ways I'm saying, well, maybe it's not the spin-off, it's really the skill, right? So I have to balance this coherence with existing theory. And let's face it, metalworking knowledge may or may not be useful in other contexts, right? That and may not have any relevance today. So I have to balance, but at the same time, I believe, at least, that this is a very consilient explanation for what happened, right? So you have to, it's a balancing between between various virtues of an explanation. Now, if you want to see a successful example, in the sense it has been published, there is a study by Brzezinski and Hounshell, 2016 SMJ, that is looking at the Meiji era cotton spinning industry. And the argument they make is that the success was due to the superior human capital of a few firms, right? Of a few firms. And they go through a number of alternate explanations, such as, is it institutional support? Is it mimicry? Is it, the act of incorporation? Is it new entrants? All of these explanations are quite coherent with existing theory. But they go on and say, look, actually, it's a story about a few people being very good, right? So again, they are trying to balance consilience, consilience with contextual realities with other virtues of the explanation, and history allows them to do that. So just to conclude very quickly, the core argument is that, look, historical explanation helps us improve judgment to balance these balance virtues. Fundamentally, what it allows us to do is it allows us to make a judgment about when we focus on one virtue more than others, what are we gaining and what are we giving up? Because the reality is there is going to be some trade-off between parsimony and consilience, for example, right? understanding consilience and coherence is going to give us some impression about how parsimonious the explanation can be. Long story, I mean, what it does is it really helps us make these judgments so that we are aware of the costs of favoring one virtue over the other. And if we may, we may even make an argument that, look, instead of talking about, oh, is it this theory, is it this variable, perhaps a better way to communicate among scholars is when discussing work is to see, is to focus on the virtues, where one scholar may be focusing on one virtue more than the other, and the discussion is really about which virtue you want to really focus on. Now, historians, I think, should care about this paper, at least it's our claim, is that the reasons, one being that, look, we are clarifying this link between history and the philosophy of science that we believe has been pretty unclear in the existing literature. And not only that, it really raises an important question. I spoke for the last 25 odd minutes about how history can complement strategy. The question needs to be asked, like, what else can history complement? So with that, I would stop right here, and I look forward to your comments and questions and your concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. If you wouldn't mind to stop sharing your screen, then we can sort of look at each other. Yeah, brilliant, super. So I realized just before I go into the questions that the chat was disabled for you guys unless you had host privileges. I've remedied that, so you can now post questions in the chat. But I'd just like to start off with my own question, if I may use my prerogative. I thought it was a really interesting talk, and up front in your talk is this polarization of strategy, which you treat sort of fairly synonymously, I feel, with the more positivist sciences and history. And I just wondered from that perspective, to what extent you had engaged in this paper and in your research around this paper with the less positivistic forms of strategy research. So I'm thinking particularly the likes of strategy as practice and areas like that. And I appreciate you don't necessarily want to dilute the focus on statistics and the historical contribution to statistics. Right. I feel that a lot of the areas you were discussing perhaps had more translation in those more qualitative areas.
Right. So we engaged with it a little bit. So because we think that fundamentally because we have to define how history is different from qualitative sciences. So this is one of the challenges you have whenever you present this to a strategy audience. Well, how is this different from qualitative research? But you're right that most of the focus is on statistical studies, right? Most of the focus is on, well, the study started off as, why is it that using statistics we are not able to do abduction clearly, right? We are not able to do abduction clearly. Now, the challenge with qualitative study, the way I see it, is that direct observation in many of our contexts is just simply not possible. Right? The accessing folks for interviews or doing an ethnographic study, it's simply not practical, right? So in most of our studies, and if you can, do that and you have very good visibility, so maybe that is fine. But in a vast majority of the statistical studies studies we are doing, we are really studying the past. So that's why that was one of the reasons why we focused on statistical studies and not on qualitative as much. But maybe we need to add something about that in the paper.
Would anyone else like to come in with a question for Sandeep?
Well, let me follow on that question. It seems to me that, so in ordinary daily life, we engage in abductive reasoning all the time. I'll use as a rough working definition of abduction, that when we apply theories and they don't work so well, we draw some inference from the not working so well, and revising our thinking about theories. It seems to me that the reason that abduction is a problem for the strategy literature is that they routinely apply statistical tests which presume that the samples are drawn naively from a population, and interpret the statistical tests which are based on that assumption, despite the fact that that's not where the hypotheses came from. I don't actually think it's far wrong in calling that crooked, though probably what it really is just a not deep knowledge of statistics. But I didn't get in your exposition why inference to the best explanation was the same thing, or even usefully treated as the same thing as abduction. It seems to me, in the way that you framed your exposition, inference to the best explanation seems like a coherent procedure without any reference to where the hypotheses came from. So I'm just a little puzzled by that. I don't want to draw you into excessively deep waters unrelated to your main purpose. But
right.
is there something simple you can say about that?
It's a fair question. So we are using, the definition we are using is from the philosophy of science, how we have defined inference to the best explanation about the consideration of alternatives and selection from the best one. Now, you are right in that there is no conclusive agreement about is IBE the same as abduction or not. There is a lot of debate going on about it, and it's just not something we wanted to get into for the purpose of the paper. But yes, you're right that there is a debate.
Let me rephrase my question in a referee-proofing way. Why do you care? Why do you care? Why don't you just talk about inference to the best explanation and leave abduction out of it?
Yeah,
aside from the fact that it seems like a vulnerability.
Yeah, no, I agree. We don't care. It's just you're right. We don't have to care. To make the argument, we don't have to care. But the challenge is that, and my co-author is also Brent. You can join in. The challenge is that most of us, that's just how it's referred to. So that's why we brought it in. But to make our argument, we just need inference to the best explanation. Okay. So, Brent, please, if you want to.
I was just going to add, Dan, it's a great question. And to be perfectly honest, I have struggled to understand the practical distinction between abduction and inference to the best explanation. As far as I understand, having read through some of this, but I'm sure not as deeply as you have, I just have found that there was this idea of abduction that got picked up and recast, perhaps by Peter Lipton, perhaps by others, as inference to the best explanation, as kind of a better, is almost a slogan, if you will. And it's all kind of dealing with the problems we have with, say, the hypodeductive approach, where nobody can figure out where the H's actually come from, if not from the setting or from, working with this within a particular data set very broadly defined. And so if you have a good idea of the distinction that you can share with us, I am all ears. I would I want to see that. What I do get frustrated about, and just to add one thing, is that certainly within strategy, the word abductive is used very loosely and without much clarity. And so what I think IBE does is it does provide, even within IBE, there's arguments about what it is, but nevertheless, it provides a lot more structure to what that idea might be, which I think would be super helpful within the strategy community.
I personally think that in writing or revising this text with an eye to publishing it for a strategy journal, you would want to minimize the possibility that some referee chooses the other side of a debate which is obscure because the concepts are obscure in order to complain to the editor about your paper. If you don't really have a dog in that fight, then don't make it easy for their dog to look for your dog. That would be my thought. Yeah, maybe if we all had a clearer notion of how these concepts are related to one another, we could make a crisper argument that would actually be useful to you. At the moment, I don't see what the argument that's useful to you is.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's good advice.
Okay, thanks very much. Ashton?
Yeah, strangely enough, my comment or question, which is kind of both, is related to this, which is, so I'm someone who's a business historian who's based in a history department. I will say it's really helpful for me because I also work in kind of a policy history vein, and I have been thinking through like how to externalize and think about how historical methods can be useful for policy analysis. So a lot of what you're saying is ringing true, resonating with me for how I've been thinking about how to apply history to policy. So that was super helpful. Thank you. But also similarly, what I'm curious about is the sort of, and you say this is for a strategy journal, but answering some questions for me that I had about the kind of the audience of this paper, specifically like, so I'm a business, like I said, business historian, policy history, have hung out with strategy scholars, not as familiar with the literature. So I'm a little like perplexed by like, why are we choosing like philosophy of science? Like, I don't, maybe that's like just really common in strategy literature, but that was like an extra hurdle for me in terms of my own understanding here. So thinking about like, who's going to be reading this, whether philosophy of science is going to be legible to your audience. And then the second piece is like, can this work both ways? Like this is focused on a strategy, you know, how strategy scholars can use historical methods, but I can envision strangely enough, a much stronger piece that actually makes an argument for both ways. Like what historians can learn from strategy methods or approaches about drawing conclusions or making, you know, more pointed arguments. So that's just, it's more of a comment, but it's really also a question about like, who do you imagine speaking to? And then we can kind of help you clarify that a little bit. So
let me start with the philosophy of science question. So the idea of inference to the best explanation, the idea of what an explanation is, what are the virtues of an explanation, these are all coming straight from the philosophy of science, right? So the reason we need to have philosophy of science is that that is how we talk. I mean, that's the medium through which we get to talk about what an explanation is and how to weigh all of this, because we are going to rely on the philosophy of science for that part. Right, so that we don't have to come up with it. Now,
yeah, that makes sense. They've already done that work for you a little bit.
Right, exactly. So I mean, so we are relying on it. There's a lot of thought about it that is there, and we are taking it and applying it here. In terms of the audience, the most important criteria for audience is a very scientific one. It is simply the list of journals that will give me tenure. Okay, no, but jokes aside, fundamentally, the honesty on that one. You know, I mean, fundamentally, we have to. I mean, I'm being in a strategy department, a strategy role. I have to. I mean, that's where I'm publishing. But I agree. I'm first of all, I'm very happy to know. Thank you. It kind of validates our effort that you're finding it useful from the policy perspective. But I absolutely agree that there's another piece that can be written about how does strategy help history. Right. So, and as a strategy person, I would love. I mean, you know, it's really.
Yeah, I feel like that's just like another article. That's not like
absolutely. That'll be another article. It'll be, you know, if I were to just think on the spot, it'll be something about how universality and likelihood helps balance consilience and coherence that historians focus on. Right. So, yeah. So, thank you, Ashton.
Yeah, thanks for the great paper.
Anyone else like to come in?
Seems that strategic management concepts have taken over business history. Thank you for that paper. I will take a look at that.
Yeah, I think that's it's a comment rather than a question, isn't it? Okay, so
Liwei, you want to just ask the question?
Well, I kind of already asked in the
Oh,
chat,
sorry.
right? But yes, I will read out my question. So I was just wondering, well, as some of the people here know, I have no relationship with a historical study. But as
except for a simple fact that your advisor is author of the paper, but yes.
Yeah, as a strategy person, I wonder, you talk about all these virtuals, does one historical study really should we link one historical study and saying it has implication for strategy, or we may not need to think about specific implication. We may say it just provide a perspective, because it is really difficult to argue, as you say, that there is something can be extended outside that specific context, but nonetheless, it provides certain perspective. And so I just wonder, maybe it would be safer to argue, or maybe it would be useful to argue it's less about direct implication. I just wonder what's your thoughts?
So, I mean, I don't think one study is enough for anything in strategy. I mean, we have a nice paper by Miles Shaver recently where he talks about it takes a body of work for us to find a relation. And in terms of updating, if one study is the final word on anything, absolutely not. I mean, what a study does is it gives you an explanation and it gives you evidence for that explanation. Later on, as more information becomes clear, we may go back and update our explanation, and that is perfectly fine, right? And this is what happened to some degree in the GM paper, I think. Sorry
to interrupt. Following on that, just a little bit more clarification. When you say metalwork experience in your job market paper, how would that be useful for like follow-up study and together to provide a explanation, or you're thinking this is we should, like, it's just open up another perspective, or there's a higher abstraction?
Well, no, this is part of the response I would write for the reviewer. But fundamentally, what you're doing, it's a balancing of virtues, Liwei. So right. So on one hand, you know, I'm trying to find a more conciliant explanation by talking about the metalworking. On the other hand, I can abstract away a little bit on a different level and say, look, it's about interdependencies, right? It's about how to manage interdependencies. It's a much more generalizable, much more universal explanation. And what to focus on, that judgment, that is what history allows me to do. Right? So which virtue to focus on, that is what history allows me to do. Is metalworking applicable to others? The answer is absolutely not. I mean, but it does raise the question about, are we talking about specific skills, or are we talking about about where working for a firm, right? So this is ultimately what it's allowing us to do, is give the capacity to make judgments about the virtues. Right, metalworking would be a more conciliant one versus, if I just stop at interdependencies, it would be a more universal one, probably. Okay. So I think that's what it gives me. And I see a comment. Okay.
Yeah, I see Brent's
comment,
and he's
yeah. So. All right. So it's. I'd like to make sure I'm not disagreeing with Brent. Yes, Trevor.
Yeah, so the thing that I really like about this conversation, Sandeep, is that you are grappling with questions of the legitimacy and usefulness of historical methods within strategy research. And you have an optimistic view of how within academic conversations you would like to see more generosity in the way that we talk about research, and particularly at the end of your conversation, you talked about conversation about different virtues, methodological virtues. And what I was wondering about is my sense of the strategy literature is that there's a lot of value that's placed on applicability in practice to some extent. That's not to say all strategy scholars care about that, but I did want to ask, I guess from a pragmatic point of view, within this project of legitimating historical methods, would it be practical to try to bring this content in a more concerted way to practitioners in the form of maybe more accessible trade books and such, that not necessarily the methodological stuff, but the actual historical narratives. And within those studies, you talk about these ideas of consilience and why they are so important, how historical judgment helps in a practical sense, and would that approach help to kind of create the conversation that you want to see happen within the strategy field? It's
a great point. I mean, I must confess, I did not think about until this point about the implication for practitioners, to be very honest with you. But I think it's a great thought that you have given us. I mean, I don't have much to add to it and say this is how it should be done, and I don't want to make stuff up sitting here, because I have not really thought about it. But yeah, it's a great point. I mean, obviously there's some benefits to, off the bat, we can see some benefits to knowing what we believe the true story was about certain firms and certain industries, about what happened and what virtues we are highlighting. But yes, that's something I have to think about. So, thank you for that question. It's funny we are working on strategy. You're so much into methodology, you forget about the practitioner. So, thank you.
Here's what I'm mostly puzzled about so far. I get that I take entirely your point that almost all strategy teaching materials and research are fundamentally about evidence in the past. And I wonder, aside from observing that historians study in an analytical way, often not recognized by these high social science people, events that happened in the past. What is it you mean exactly by historical methods? There's a sense in which that person, when you were on the job market, who seems to have said, how's this different from general qualitative research, by which I guess they meant, how's this different from business setting or firm ethnographies in some distinctly past set of circumstances. So that seems actually like kind of a good question. What is it to be a distinctly historical method? By distinctly, I guess I mean, what's a historical method as opposed to a historical subject?
Thank you, Dan. So this is perhaps the most difficult question for us. And the challenge, so we have certain qualities of historical methods, such as, that we talked about hermeneutics, the idea of contextualization, the idea of source criticism, that are very unique to how historians operate. I mean, a typical qualitative scholar would not be, may not, it's not clear how much they engage in that. And not only that, construction of narratives, how they present their evidence, these are all quite unique to how historians present their explanations. But what is historical method? First of all, there isn't one method. It's methods is one thing I've learned, and in the theories of history, it is actually not very clear to me from reading how historians say this is our method, or this is the clear method that we are using. So the way we are getting around it, to be very honest, is that because of this lack of very clear definition, is that we are talking about features that historical scholars are using in their research, such as contextualization, hermeneutics, etc., construction of narratives, etc. A clear definition, we don't have it, mostly because I'm not sure the historians have come. I mean, maybe the historians in the group can correct me, please do. But this was, I went on a search for this. What is this? What is the method? Sorry, Dan, I think you're muted.
I once asked a set of colleagues and friends in my university's history department precisely this question, and had they not been my friends, I would have guessed from their answers that they would have been carefully moving to make sure that they were between me and the door rather than the other way around. I mean, they vigorously denied that there was any such thing. I'm not sure I credit this, right. But it was certainly what they said.
Which is why, I mean, from a practical sense, we are using the word historical explanation rather than, we have some idea about what an explanation is, and we have some idea about what are the features that we can add to an explanation to make it historical. So we use historical explanation as opposed to historical methods when we make the argument. So.
If I could come in with a sort of follow-up question to that on methods and go down the line of sources, to what extent are you going to, or have you sort of explicated what you mean by historical, the sources that are going to provide this this inference? Could you say something about that in relation to how you see this sort of framework being operationalized as a method?
So what are the sources? So, I mean, we talk a little bit about how, there is some papers that talk about how to think about sources, how it's closer, is it a first-hand source? How close is it to the event? Who is the author? What's the circumstance in which it was created, etc. So we are leaning on the historians for that part. In terms of the types of sources, like, do you mean like, should it be books? Should it be newspapers? Is that what you mean? If so, we have not thought so much about it, but about that part, but we have some qualities of good sources that we are using from how historians have thought about it. Right. So, I mean, the argument we are making in the paper is that, look, that really helps with concealment. So we're really bringing the focus back on the virtues. There's probably a paper that can be written just on how to criticize sources, but which we are not getting into. We are just saying, look, I mean, this is how historians do it. Let me, they have figured it out how to do it. Let me tell you how they are doing it, and just relying on it. And about there are a few pieces on it that we have cited that we are relying on, right? So for the virtues, we rely on philosophy of science. For some of these, we rely on historians, and we're trying to bridge it.
Super. Would anyone else like to come in? I don't want to take up the time for the final question. So would anyone like to ask any final?
So Adam, I'll jump in. So I've been putting a couple of comments into the chat. And I just wanted to highlight this concept of judgment, and I think that it is something that is an incredibly powerful concept. It's kind of like wisdom. And wisdom and judgment are things that, you can take science as a starting point, but you need to go beyond just science to have either. And I think that the powerful thing about historical explanation is that it's not as firmly grounded in science as kind of statistical methods might be. And so what you get from historical methods is this powerful combination of art and science and values and these things that kind of make the human condition. And I think that it is that kind of complexity and, as you say, consilience that really makes historical explanation powerful. So that's why I was asking about practitioners, because practitioners don't really care so much about science necessarily, but they do care a lot about judgment.
Great. No, that's a fantastic point, Trevor. Thank you. Thank you. More ideas to think about as we write the paper. So.
And a nice point to finish up our session on, I think. So yeah, it remains for me to thank Sandeep, thank you for all of your contributions, and also to give you a plug for our next session, which is occurring on the 6th of April. The title is Freedom from the New World, the Invention of Beet Sugar, and that's David Sigerman of University of Virginia presenting. So please do join us for that, and the invite information is on the various social medias and blog as usual. So with that, I'll let you all go and enjoy your evenings or the rest of your days.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. So Adam, we'll just stay back for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, great.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
See you soon.
See you, David.
See you later.
So it's nice to meet you, Adam. I heard
Yeah.
so much about you, but we've never, the paths have never crossed.
Well, please, some of it's good. Yeah, sorry about. I didn't want my question to sound like it was just the standard.
No.
Why isn't this qualitative research question? But,
No. Actually, actually, it is actually the most important question that we have to overcome. Really, I mean.
Well, I was just sitting there thinking, because I research strategy, but I'm miles away from the sort of methods you do or the sort of approach you take. So for me, you were talking about a strategy that is not my strategy.
Right.
I guess I was speaking on behalf of the other strategy.
Right. So actually, this is the thing. So we wanted to be very clear about it. So we had this discussion. Are we contributing to strategy research, or are we contributing to quantitative studies in strategy research? Because we don't want to get into the qualitative. I mean, it's just, the problem is the philosophy of science of qualitative studies, that's a whole other beast that